Good morning, folks. Nice to see you. Thank you for coming to join us. As you're arriving, please can you do the usual thing? Pop your name and organisation in the chat box. It's just helpful for us to know who's actually arrived from the people who registered. Hopefully you're expecting to be at our webinar on adult safeguarding. So we're just going to get everybody in from the waiting room, and then we'll do a bit of an intro and we'll get going. This is being recorded, so hopefully that's fine with you all, and I'm sure we'll be able to share the recording for colleagues who've not been able to get along. So we'll just let people flow in. If you're just arriving, please do the chat box thing. Thank you. It's really helpful for us to know who joins. Oh, we've got a great array of people. Excellent. And for those of you who managed to get to our governance forum last week, you'll know that safeguarding and whistleblowing is particularly important in our world of regulation, in our new world of regulation, which Peter will talk us through. So how's it looking, Helen?
I think we've got most
in terms of the waiting room.
Got a flurry coming in.
Oh, okay, bit of a flurry. Right, let's give people another minute. Oh, I can see lovely, happy, smiling faces. That's nice. Excellent. Oh gosh, we've got a good attendee profile here. So just while I'm getting the last few people in, we will have time for questions after the presentations from our various participants, our various presenters. But if you're anything like me, sometimes I have to pop my thoughts or questions in the chat. So please do pop questions in the chat as we go, and we'll try and pick them up. And if we can't, we can always ask Peter to do us a bit of a follow-up Q&A if we get loads of questions and we run out of time. It's just sometimes handy. If they're in the chat, then you don't forget them and we don't forget to try and answer them. Okay, how are we doing, Helen?
Yeah,
we're flowing. Excellent. So welcome to our webinar hosted by the National Care Forum. Oh, can you all go on mute? Otherwise get a lot of feedback. Thank you very much. So yeah, welcome to our webinar. We're delighted that we have got some support from some eminent folks. So our webinar is led by Peter, who is a bit of a guru in terms of safeguarding adults, approaches, good practice, expertise, and kind of latest understanding. And Peter's supported by some colleagues from one of our members, Friends of the Elderly, who he does a lot of work with in supporting their approach to adult safeguarding. And I think I'm right in saying that we've got a kind of partner webinar after Christmas, thinking about speaking up and whistleblowing. So I'm going to hand over to Peter. If you could do the usual thing of going on mute, questions and thoughts in the chat, and our various presenters will try and respond as best they can. Thank you very much, Peter.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much for that introduction, Liz. And it's thanks to everybody for joining this morning. It's really fantastic to see how many people have joined to talk about adult safeguarding. And I'm really just delighted to be able to share with you a few things which I think are really interesting and important about adult safeguarding. And they're probably things which are probably not things that you will have covered in your kind of standard safeguarding training and updates. So just to start really with a quick introduction to myself, so they know who is talking. I've worked in social care for many years now, actually. I was operations director for 6 years of Sense, which is quite a large national charity supporting people with complex needs, about 60 CQ services across the country, and it actually had very well developed arrangements for adult safeguarding. It was one of the first charities to have an independently chaired safeguarding board of the kind we're going to be talking about later on with colleagues from Friends of the Elderly. Been working as a consultant since 2015, a wide range of kind of work really, but in terms of supporting care providers with safeguarding, I've done safeguarding health checks, stroke audits, which would include auditing policies, paperwork, but linking that up with a lot of engagement with people supported by services, families, staff, etc. to see what's really going on, reviews and investigations. As you'll know from the webinar, I'm independent chair of Friends of the Elderly's Safeguarding and Ops Subcommittee, and also independent chair of the Safeguarding Board at Midland Heart Housing Association. Just to summarise the running order, I'm going to start with a short section about the Charity Commission guidance on safeguarding, then talk a bit about pointers towards the prevalence of abuse and neglect in care services, and then move on to some themes from safeguarding adult reviews, the Friends of the Elderly section, and then there should be time at the end for some questions and discussion. So the Charity Commission guidance on safeguarding. I think the main point to flag up is that from the Charity Commission's point of view, they view the word safeguarding much more broadly than we would normally do within the care services context. So particularly for adult safeguarding, that was set out in statute in the Care Act 2014, and it's quite specifically the duties that apply when we're working with people who have care and support needs. The Charity Commission uses safeguarding in a rather broader context. It talks there, you can see on the slide, charities must take reasonable steps to protect people who come into, to protect from harm, people who come into contact with your charity, and that includes people who benefit from your charity's work. So that would include people receiving their services, staff, volunteers, and other people who come into contact with your charity. So that could include visitors, people attending fundraising events, could include people who are beneficiaries who don't have care and support needs. It could include people using online forums. That's really a much broader kind of concept from the Charity Commission's point of view. And they've issued guidance which is quite long and detailed, and it's quite kind of strong and onerous, I suppose, really. And it does say that if something goes badly wrong, they will check whether these things are in place, and if they aren't, they will hold trustees to account. So there's quite a lot in it. Having said that, it is really pretty straightforwardly set out. It's quite clear to follow this particular guidance, and there's a handy infographic here within the guidance which lists 10 things which trustee boards are asked to do in relation to safeguarding. So obviously I won't go through all of that in detail. Just some of the things on the top line. As a first point is really around having adequate safeguarding policies, codes of conduct, and the second point, identifying possible risks to beneficiaries and to anyone else connected with your charity. And then there are some more detailed points around things like having a process to review who needs a DBS check, etc. So in terms of how to approach this really and how it links into adult safeguarding in a care services context, I suppose my suggestion really would be to start with that process of looking at what the possible risks would be and seeing, and I think what you'll then find is you've got in place things to cover the kind of risks that we're talking about here. So for example, one of the areas to cover is possible risk of harm to staff, and the guidance says that that should be covered by having policies for bullying and harassment and a policy for whistleblowing, for example. So I'm sure you'll all have that in place. One of the areas of harm to consider is the possibility of a data breach, and again that would be covered by your data protection policy. So I think it's really a question of going through using the guidance to go through all the, looking at what the risks and harms could be, and assuring yourselves that you've got in place arrangements to meet those requirements. And we've had, in this context, we've had a specific question from one of the NSF members about how this would work and how this would fit together in relation to your safeguarding adult policy, which is used within care services. And the question was, do we have any guidance on whether this wider picture can be covered within the safeguarding adults policy used in care services, or does it need a separate policy? And I mean, there's nothing in the guidance that says it should be done one way or the other. Personally, I would always recommend keeping the policy that's used within care services as simple and straightforward as possible, and really focusing on a straightforward way on adult safeguarding, and particularly people supported by the care service, rather than trying to include within it issues around how staff are safeguarded, volunteers, etc., etc. It just feels like that is making it a more complicated policy for staff to understand. But I think there's nothing specific in the guidance that says it should be done one way or the other. I thought I'd just mention the question around reporting serious incidents to the Charity Commission. So the Charity Commission requires charities to report serious incidents to them, and there's a guidance again, and within all these, where I'm talking about guidance and reports, all of that, there'll be references to all of that in the notes from these, on the notes to the slide, so you'll be able to get that after the webinar today. So serious incidents have to be reported to the Charity Commission. There's a list in the guidance about what should be included, and one of those items is harm to people who come into contact with your charity, so that is a safeguarding aspect of it. Again, it's pretty straightforward guidance, and there's a handy tool within it, a handy table within it, which gives you some examples of things which need to be reported and some examples of things that don't need to be reported. So on the left-hand side of the page, things that do need to be reported, that includes a beneficiary or others connected have come to serious harm, that would need to be reported. Any allegation that a staff member has physically or sexually assaulted a beneficiary, that would need to be reported. Whereas on the right-hand side, if you become aware of allegations related to a beneficiary outside of the charity, then that wouldn't need to be reported. And the final point I've just added there is that the Charity Commission does recognise that some charities who run care services may have a high number to report, and there is the option to ask them to agree a process of bulk reporting for most concerns. So that could be like a quarterly report rather than having to do it each time unless there was something, particularly more serious. So I thought, shall I include this or not? On the one hand, those of you who are charities, I'm sure you all know this. On the other hand, from experience, I would say that quite often it doesn't happen when it necessarily should do. So I thought it was worth putting in that section just as a bit of a reminder. So that's the first item I wanted to cover, which was around the Charity Commission aspect. So quite often when I'm working with organisations, questions come up such as, how many safeguarding concerns should we expect to see from services? Is it a high number or a small number? And behind that really is the question about the prevalence of abuse and neglect in care services. So I've got a couple of slides really just to give you some information about how this is viewed, some information as far as we can. There is some official statistics that give us a bit of an idea about some of this. So every year, local authorities have to send in a detailed return to NHS Digital, covering all of their safeguarding activities. And this is from the return for 21-22. And this is basically a summary of the number of completed Section 42 inquiries during that particular year. And it's quite easy to extract the numbers for nursing and care homes. And you'll see from that the total number of Section 42 inquiries from care homes in that year was about 51,000. So thinking about the fact that there's roughly 15,000 care homes in England, that's kind of an average of 3 or 4 per care home per year. But that tells us something, but it doesn't tell us everything really, partly because it covers concerns which aren't actually anything to do with the care service, so where the service may have reported a concern elsewhere, but also because local authorities are very inconsistent in their propensity to open and complete a Section 42 inquiry. And if you look elsewhere in those NHS digital statistics, those inconsistencies are really obvious. So it does give us a bit of an idea, but not the whole picture, I think it's fair to say. So I've also dug out a brief note really from 3 bits of research and reports which have tried to work out better information really about the level of abuse and neglect within care services. So just to run through those very, very briefly, the biggest report that was from published by UCL, University College London in 2018, and this was a big, thorough academic study which involved about 1,500 care staff from I think 92 care homes being asked to complete anonymous questionnaires about what they'd witnessed in the last 3 months. It's a really interesting report, actually, well worth reading. There's a lot in it, but the particular point I've highlighted there is where staff were asked to report on having carried out or witnessed abuse. And you can see that 1.1% of staff said they'd carried out or witnessed a resident being hit or shaken in the last 3 months, and much larger numbers actually in relation to verbal abuse. And I suppose 1.1% doesn't necessarily sound a huge number, but if you kind of extrapolate that and work that out in terms of a larger staff team, I think you'd be pretty clear that that would be a significantly higher number of instances of this form of physical abuse than probably most organisations would receive as reports. There was another report which was published in the Nursing Times in 2017, and this was a smaller bit of research. And what they did was they involved 5 new care homes, and they also asked all the staff who'd worked in homes previously to complete questionnaires about what had happened in their previous care homes. And as you'll see, 88% of staff there said they'd witnessed abuse in the homes they'd previously worked in. And then I've also flagged up a really interesting report, a more local and informal report from Healthwatch Oxfordshire 2015, where they contacted and they involved about 200 people who were using health or care services across Oxfordshire, some via online questionnaire and some via an interview. And of those 10.9% said they'd witnessed abuse. But I think the most interesting point is that fewer than half had said that they'd reported what they'd witnessed. And I suppose just going back to the UCL report, one of the things that separated out was prevalence within charities and private sector, and really found very little difference at all. And I just wanted to also add this slide, which is 3 situations where things have gone very badly wrong in services run by respected charities. And I think that's probably the biggest risk and probably the biggest worry, particularly for larger organisations, that something will have gone wrong, which no one has reported in one of their services out there somewhere. So I guess the key priority really to focus a bit on is kind of things that we can do to encourage people to report and reduce that risk of underreporting. And I suppose just to mention 2 or 3 things which, just from working with organisations, are the kind of things which can quite often be missed, I think. One is that instance between people supported by a service are quite often not recognised as being potentially abuse. If you look at accident books or complaints files, quite often you'll find within that issues that came in and were dealt with, but they weren't referred as adult safeguarding issues. And I think it's partly, if you receive a complaint, you think, oh, it's a complaint, we'll deal with it as a complaint. But I've seen that in quite a few organisations where there are things which haven't been covered up at all, but they just simply haven't been recognised and moved over into the adult safeguarding arena. And verbal abuse, I've kind of put it in inverted commas because in the Care Act guidance, it's not a type of abuse in its own right, it's a subset of psychological abuse. But I think we probably still know what we mean by that. And I think the numbers often is not reported in the way that it might be. But beyond that kind of issue of recognition, I do think a bigger issue is probably that it's quite difficult for people to raise concerns. It can be a very difficult thing for people to do. And often people are reluctant to raise concerns, and actually still people are often worried about what the repercussions would be if they raised a concern. And thinking there really about people supported by a care service, about relatives and about members of staff. And quite often what I find is talking to people, they may say, yes, I know how to report a concern. Yes, of course, I would report a concern if I did have one. But if you probe a bit further, there's more anxiety about repercussions. And also, if you talk to people about have they had a concern in the past and had they reported it, and quite often you find that people didn't. So I think there is still anxiety about raising concerns and the potential implications, and staff in particular, really can be quite anxious about that. So there's a list there of things which I think help in making it more likely perhaps that people will report concerns. I think it's all about making safeguarding as easy a thing to report as possible, partly with a wide range of different areas, ways that people can report, just making it a kind of normal day-to-day thing, talking about it, communicating about it, so it's not a kind of a big issue. Obviously, if people do raise concern, it's important they have a positive and efficient response. And if people don't have a good response, that will put them off reporting in future. And also, word gets around. People know about these things. If I'm doing a bit of work safeguarding health checks or audit, I always try and possible to talk to people who've raised concerns in the past. And it's not uncommon. People say, it was a really difficult process. People have said, almost wish I hadn't raised it. I'm not sure I would do in future. And if people have had a negative, difficult experience of raising concern, then I said, other people will know about that. So I think it's really good to try and get feedback from people who have raised concerns to see how the process was from their point of view. And I suppose more generally, it's really about keeping in touch with services, which I know everyone's really busy, but it's good to have, if you can, more in-depth conversations with, with people, with residents, day service users, staff, just to find out what's going on in people's minds. Because I think often simply saying how are things, people say fine, and you may not, find out as much as you'd want to in that situation. So there's a few things there. I've actually written a blog about some of this, which gives a bit more detail, which hopefully is going to be published in the next week or two. So I can send out a link to that blog when it comes out to those who've been on the webinar today. But those are just a few points there. Really, just that I think it'd be good to consider, and I think really need an ongoing proactive plan to try and make safeguarding concerns as easy to raise as you can do. And just to add in this finding in this section, to mention this excellent publication from NICE and Sky. It's not a typical NICE publication at all. It's only 4 pages long, and it's very readable. And it's got some really good points, particularly about reflective practice. It's very nicely written. You can give it to staff teams and ask them to use it as a checklist and to think about how they're working with safeguarding concerns and learning from them. So definitely that is well worth digging out if you haven't seen it previously. My only slight, very small issue with the guide is it's got one recommendation at the moment. Is really not very straightforward for care services to implement. And what it says is that services should learn from any relevant safeguarding adult reviews. And it rather glibly says they should be available from your local safeguarding adults board. So just to recap, a safeguarding adults review must be commissioned by the local safeguarding board where there's been serious abuse or neglect, most often when someone's died and there's concern about how someone had been safeguarded. So quite a number of these reviews get completed every year. A lot of them are now published on this website, National Network, which is a really good step forward. And I've kind of been looking at them over recent weeks. I've counted 49 as having been published so far in 2022. 9 of those, I think, involve situations where care service was a central focus. And I do think there's a lot of learning in these reviews for care services. But at the moment, there doesn't appear to be any systematic process to make the learning available from safeguarding adult reviews for care services. So in the absence of that, I've spent a bit of time reading these reviews. I've put some notes together, which I hope will be of interest to you. I've suggested a few that if you're interested might be worth looking at, but I will include in the notes that go around a few health checks about this really. First of all, not every review is published. Secondly, some of them actually are published a long time after the event. But the biggest one, I suppose, is really the material really merits a proper, more systematic review rather than me kind of reading them and giving you my thoughts about them. But in the absence of anyone doing it more thoroughly at the moment, I think it's kind of hopefully going to be interesting and useful for you to see my kind of more informal thoughts. So I'm just going to mention a few of them, and it's a bit of a list, just some which might be useful for you to look at, and then I'll try and draw some wider points really. So it's 4 really, just to mention where actually the issue was something which appeared to be a shortfall within a particular care service of different kinds. If you want to look these up, you can do it on the website I mentioned, and these are the titles, so you'll be able to find them quite easily. Just to run through them very briefly, the first one, Mr. R, someone who unfortunately fell down a fire escape, and that really followed him having to move from one care home to another at short notice due to a care home closure. This was in 2015, I think. I think it's fair to say there's been a lot more guidance about short notice care home closure since then, so hopefully it would be a more thorough process. The Pamela Ratsay SAR was a situation where there'd just been very poor pressure care within a care home, and a couple where there were some issues within home care services. So with Anne, this person supported went to A&E. The care agency assumed that she would be admitted, and they cancelled the service. In the event she was taken home, obviously nobody was there, nobody supported her, and she was found dead a few days later. And there was another one from another home care situation where the home care worker had been the only person to visit a service user 3 times a day for 5 weeks, and there'd been very poor care during that time. The worker was actually charged with neglect, but I think the learning point for the care service was the fact that they only deployed one person for a whole 5-week period, and literally no one else had seen the person being supported, so no one was aware there had been that decline in their health. So there's a small number where there were kind of direct issues in relation to care services. There's a couple of just highlighted here, which is slightly different and slightly more complicated actually. And they're both situations where the care home was supporting people with a really complicated mixture of physical and mental health needs. And in one situation, the person was refusing some care and support and treatment. And in another, the person had behaviours which made the care and support very difficult. And within the reviews, the care homes weren't actually criticised in terms of the care they provided. But what was clear was these are very difficult situations where everybody knew, all the agencies knew things were not going well, and no one really got to grips with it. No one actually formed a proper multidisciplinary approach. There was no really clear plan. And in both cases, the interesting comment from the reviewer was that while the services were tentative, they could have actually been more proactive in raising concerns and pushing forward for a multidisciplinary approach, which really was clearly required in that situation. And I think the Ben report is really interesting actually. It talks about the care home being reluctant to raise their concern about the situation because they thought other agencies would feel they were saying they were being unhelpful. But what the reviewer was saying was really, no, this was a situation where someone clearly was at risk of harm, and the care home really should have raised that particular concern and not worried about how it would be perceived by others. So that's a quick run through some which are directly about care services, which might be worth you while looking at. I have had a quick look at the other ones, the ones that are not specifically around care services. And I suppose it's clear to say from that that the biggest issue coming up in these reviews is self-neglect. More than half are self-neglect issues. Capacity is also a common issue. And I don't really mean by that just the person didn't have capacity, more that capacity was a grey area or a difficult area. That assessments weren't necessarily done when they should have been done, or were done but came to conclusions which were perhaps not right. And there was quite a lot of overlap. Quite a few of those situations were where people had a care service at some point during the period that were being reviewed. There was quite a lot of overlap between those different characteristics. And I think really just reading those reviews just highlights the challenges around self-neglect and the fact that particularly home care workers are often kind of right on the front line of that, but probably have the least professional background and the least input around working with some of the most complex and challenging people within the sector. And I suppose just to note that there were several cases actually where the person or their family had declined or cancelled a care service, and what the reports was really saying was actually, with hindsight, that could have been a situation where that could have been seen as a bit of a trigger for something going wrong, and that could have triggered a review at an earlier stage than actually happened in practice. I appreciate that's kind of really rather rapid run through kind of a huge amount of material, but I suppose just a few overall takeaways from that really. One is that point about the fact that statutory agencies can't always be assumed to be responding well, and a number of reviews saying the care service had raised a concern, hadn't been responded to, and really ideally the care service would have raised it again and pushed it forward. As I mentioned, the challenges around self-neglect. Around capacity, there's a lot of discussion really around this concept of executive capacity. And I'm no expert in that particular area, but in summary, people may appear to be able to make a decision, but actually if they can't actually execute the decision, then the emerging view is they don't actually have capacity for that decision. And if you look in the draft MCA Code of Conduct, that is now covered as an addition in those paragraphs. And I suppose overall, really, that's my personal view, that I think there is potentially significant learning for care services from these reviews, and it would be good if there was something more systematic, a more systematic way really of putting it out. And I suppose just on that final point about learning, just wanted to mention a couple of reviews which go back a bit further actually. So they were published in October 2015, and both of them were around people with learning disabilities who died as a result of constipation in Suffolk. And I can remember reading those reports at the time and really being quite shocked, partly that had happened, but I suppose also from a personal point of view. I spent many years managing services for people with complex needs. Often they did have to struggle with constipation, and just not really seeing it as a particular high risk issue in the same way that, you know, dysphagia, diabetes, etc. We've done all the risk assessments, but constipation has not really been on our agenda. I think that was probably, you know, fairly widely held situation. On the right hand of the slide, you can see there is that information now produced by NHS England, which raises the profile of this particular risk. So I just show that there can be a link between these reviews and information and guidance, albeit one that doesn't always happen particularly quickly at the moment. So that's a very quick sprint through safeguarding adult reviews. I suppose we're just to promote them and to encourage everyone to think about looking at them, and hopefully some ideas as to reviews that might be useful to look at if you get the chance. And there's a couple of others that I took out of the presentation just for time today, but I'll give you details of those in the notes and the PowerPoint slides afterwards as well. Okay, so now I wanted to move on to talk about the arrangements around governance of safeguarding at NCF member Friends of the Elderly. So just to give you the overview of the charity, it's a well-established charity supporting older people for over 100 years. Currently operates 9 care homes, 4-day services, and it also has a charitably funded programme of grants for older people who live on low incomes. So just to tell you a bit about the Safeguarding Adult Subcommittee, the background to this was some work that I did with Friends of the Elderly. I think it was back in 2016, and we did a really an in-depth review of all the arrangements and policies around safeguarding adults. And one of the actions that arose from that was to establish the Safeguarding Adults Subcommittee. So this is a group which provides independent scrutiny. It acts as a critical friend. It monitors safeguarding concerns, how they're responded to, reviews policies and staff training, helps the charity to keep up to date with adult safeguarding, and it reports each year to the charity trustees. So just to show you really what this looks like in practice, so I act as the independent chair. We have 2 other independent external members, one of whom is a former CQC inspector and one of whom has a local authority safeguarding background. 2 trustees also sit on the group. We have spaces for 3 relatives, of whom Suzanne is one, who will speak very shortly, and we have a number of senior managers. And within that, there's a division. Really, we have the operational managers, but we also separately have the managers who look after the quality and auditing functions, and they're the ones who provide the reports to the subcommittee on safeguarding concerns. So we have that separation of roles, which is also a good thing from a governance point of view. We have in the past had a couple of people supported by the charity, but it's proved really quite practically difficult to organise that, and there's actually few people, I think, now supported by Friends of the Elderly who would really be in a position to join the subcommittee, and particularly with the pandemic, we've at the moment we just haven't been able to move ahead with that. But we have taken a range of other approaches to getting input from people being supported, which we'll talk about in a moment. But I'm going to pass firstly over to Sue Smith, who's the charity secretary, and she's going to talk to you about how the subcommittee links in with the charity trustees.
Oh, hello, Peter. So I can't tell if anyone can see me or not, or hear me.
Yeah, you're absolutely fine. So go ahead.
Okay, I've got me now. Sorry. Hello, everybody. Thanks very much, Peter. Yeah, this is just a very, very quick sort of summary of how the SAS, the Safeguarding Adult Subcommittee, fits into our sort of overall governance. So as we've been hearing in terms of the sort of charity commission approach, we know that the board retains ultimate responsibility for safeguarding. In that broader sense, we as a care provider clearly have our focus particularly on the people that we look after. But the trustees are very aware that it's a broader responsibility as well. So just a few things really that the board does to sort of maintain that safeguarding sort of golden thread, if you like, that runs through everything. We keep sort of safeguarding to the fore by having safeguarding as such as the actual first material business item on every board agenda, after sort of a welcome and apologies, that sort of thing. We have safeguarding failure, as you'd expect, as a key risk on our risk register. And then basically the board assigns the oversight of that safeguarding risk and sort of management of that risk to one of our board committees, which is the Service Delivery Committee. And then back in after the work Peter was talking about, when we created the Safeguarding Adult Subcommittee, it was basically set up as a subcommittee of that Service Delivery Committee. So the reporting lines are essentially that the Peter produces a report after every quarterly Safeguarding Adult Subcommittee meeting. That report gets agreed by the committee members, and that gets reported into the Service Delivery quarterly meetings. And obviously that will highlight any particular issues that have come out of the SASC meetings, and raise any matters that they think need escalating as well up to the trustees on the SDC, the Service Delivery Committee. And they in turn will then report on to the Board of Trustees. So that's it in a nutshell. So while the SASC sort of looks in detail at all the processes, the procedures, how they're being implemented, and as he said, we have two of our board members who are actually part of the subcommittee, so they're involved in that as well. The board also basically approves the membership of the subcommittee. It approves their terms of reference, and it approves their work plan. So it's sort of the board just maintains that sort of oversight of what the subcommittee is doing. The subcommittee's terms of reference, they also include the ability and in fact a duty for the non-FOTI, non-Friends of the Elderly employee members to go direct to our board chair if they think or perceive that management, senior managers are not addressing any issues, particular issues of concern they've got. And likewise, the SASC, the subcommittee terms of reference include a sort of duty, if you like, for the non-employee members to report and raise any concerns externally, as you'd expect with any sort of regulatory authorities. As Peter mentioned, in his slide, the Safeguarding Adult Subcommittee produces an annual report, which is a very thorough sort of review of all the actual numbers of things, the numbers of concerns that have been raised, particular areas where they think there might be room for improvement, and provides assurance under 5 separate areas which are included in their terms of reference. And that all goes up to the board as well, and that's considered in detail by the whole board. I think really that's it in a nutshell. As Peter's saying and about the Charity Commission, I mean, as a care provider, we clearly have that focus on our service users, our daycare clients and our home care residents. But we also do carry out, we have the board workshops periodically, and we have, for instance, we've done one on safeguarding as a core governance function. So that basically reflects what Peter was telling you about, and we use that infographic as well to go through and sort of compare what we do against that infographic at board level. So that does work very well, that Charity Commission guidance, I think. And we actually had totally out of the blue a case opened, not against us, but as part of a process that the Charity Commission undertook to look at governance arrangements in a sort of safeguarding, including safeguarding, wasn't only safeguarding, but including covering safeguarding, following, I think it was the Oxfam issues that they heard a while back. And one of the things they were focusing on there was exactly this subject. So they looked very closely at our obviously at all our safeguarding policies themselves, but also about the arrangements in place for how the trustees maintained that oversight of safeguarding issues. And I think this process with the Safeguarding Adult Subcommittee stood us in very good stead, and we got a clean bill of health, basically, which is always nice, obviously. And we were chosen completely at random. It felt at first that we'd been picked for a particular reason, but it wasn't. So I just think it's a really good model. Having those independent people on the subcommittee just gives you that fresh pair of eyes. You get very involved, obviously, as part of the management team, and certainly the service managers. Peter does a great job for us as our chair. And as you'll hear from Suzanne shortly, it's great to have that perspective as well from a relative point of view. I suspect that's all the time I've got really, so that's just very much a whistle-stop tour, and I will hand over to Suzanne to just give you her sort of views of being a part of that Safeguarding Adult Committee as a relative of one of our care home residents.
Yeah, hi, I'm not sure, again, a bit like Sue, not sure if you can see me or hear me, but I'm going to assume you can. So.
Yes, we can see you and hear you. Hey.
Hi, everyone. Hello, morning. Yeah, so I'm going to just talk a little bit about my own experiences being part of the Safeguarding Adult Subcommittee at Friends of the Elderly. As Peter has said, I'm a relative representative on this committee. So my mum's been a resident in Friends of the Elderly care home since December 2015. And I volunteered to join the Safeguarding Adult Subcommittee when it first started in 2017. So on the slide there, you can just see really what I'm going to run through, a whistle-stop tour of it. I found it really rewarding. And it's helped me a great deal gaining insight into how elderly people are looked after. I mean, when I first started on the committee, I had no knowledge really about care provision and a very minimal understanding of safeguarding. But I've certainly learned a lot from all the training sessions that are provided for the subcommittee, and from the experiences shared within, from the other members of the committee within Friends of the Elderly, and particularly from the experts in care of the elderly who have been part of our group, the outside experts. So I feel the voice of the resident or the daycare centre clients and their families is crucial in considering safeguarding and making safeguarding related decisions. So as a relative, I can provide that perspective. I feel Friends of the Elderly really value the viewpoint of their residents and their day centre clients and those people's relatives. So as a member of the Safeguarding Adult Committee, I think my input is listened to and it is considered, and it's an important part of being a member of the team. So my perspective is of an interested person who's not a professional carer, but is a significant stakeholder in that care provision. And that viewpoint, I think, does help to kind of broaden the focus within the committee group. So I've got a full role in the Safeguarding Adult Subcommittee. Just in practical terms, we meet quarterly as the whole group of the subcommittee for at least half a day. We have a full agenda and supporting papers are sent to us to read through about a week beforehand. So that's a bit of preparation to be done. in the days leading up to it. We have held meetings online, obviously during COVID restrictions, and also in person. I think the in-person meetings are generally more successful. I think we've probably all experienced that, the meetings. We get to just share a little bit more. So after about a year of operating the Safeguarding Adults Subcommittee, we set up an additional smaller group to review all the safeguarding cases in detail. I think this was a definite benefit. So this smaller group, which I'm a part of, looks at all the safeguarding reports over the previous 3 months. And then we take one safeguarding case from the past and we study it in depth. So our aim in this is to ensure that all the safeguarding concerns have been followed up thoroughly. And very importantly, we're looking for what Friends of the Elderly can share and learn from these cases and share across the organisation. We are there to be supportive of the staff who've dealt with the safeguarding in the first instance. Really, we want to ensure best possible care and outcomes, both for people who receive care from Friends of the Elderly and their families, as well as the staff who provide that care. The findings from these reviews, recommendations from this smaller group are then presented to the main Safeguarding Adults Subcommittee at the next meeting. And it really does provide reassurance that the detailed oversight of safeguarding cases is achieved. We have learned, we have shared some learnings, and there have been a number of changes and improvements introduced from the reviews and recommendations of the whole Safeguarding Adults Subcommittee. I did notice a query coming up. I'm sure we're going to answer some questions later, but I just saw one about how I was recruited. It was a while ago. I thought about this earlier today. I was trying to remind myself. I'm pretty certain that it was from a Friends of the Elderly newsletter that was generally circulated for residents and relatives. Subsequently, we have conducted a webinar for relatives, which was, again, that was a recruitment exercise. But it's kind of word of mouth, and once you're hooked in, it's good to be a part of. I feel like it has been a valuable role and valued as well. So I'm happy to answer questions later on as well. But right now, I think that's me. And how many relatives have been recruited over the period of since 2017? I think we've had around about 4. But my mum has lived a long time at a care home. So some of the other people, their relatives are no longer cared for by Friends of the Elderly. So obviously those people are no longer part of the Safeguarding Adults Subcommittee. But yeah. Okay, I'm not going to answer that latest question, and I'm just going to hand back to Peter right now. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, Sue and Suzanne. That's really, really great. I'm just going to finish off. I can get onto the next slide with just a kind of final slide there, which just summarizes some of the things the subcommittee has done over the last year or so. We've completed a survey which went out to everyone, all the residents, day service users, staff, relatives. One of the other external members did a detailed review based on visits to 5 services. We've started a newsletter following each meeting, which is just partly about getting more information out about about safeguarding. The webinar Suzanne's mentioned and the subgroup, and the members are now post-COVID. We're now starting some informal visits just to go out to services and just to really have a chat with people and to partly to kind of talk about the subcommittee, but partly just to get a better feel for how things are. And I suppose finally to mention the local authority escalation process. So one comment I think from one of you on the webinar in advance was around the fact that local authorities don't always keep services up to date, don't always share information about how things are going. And I think everybody finds that is the case. So what we've agreed with Friends of the Elderly is an escalation process whereby if the service manager doesn't get a response, it goes initially to the regional manager or director. They have a go, and if they're not successful, then what we do is have a letter which goes out from myself as independent chair of the subcommittee to the local authority asking for a response. And that's actually been quite helpful in terms of getting a response where previously there hadn't been responses coming in. Those are the completion of our slides. We've got some more questions. I suppose just before we go on to those, just to say that over the next couple of days, I'll send you all a copy of the PowerPoint slides, and you'll see in the notes of the PowerPoint slides, there's links to all the reports and surveys that we refer to here. So there's quite a lot more information there. And if you have any comments or questions or anything you'd like to discuss, then please do get in touch, and those are our contact details there. So we've got some more questions coming in on the chat. Shall I hand back to you, Liz, though, to coordinate the questions? Is there anything that you'd like to?
Yes, for sure. There's some great questions. Helen is asking how you kind of do the full circle of accountability governance in other agencies. So how does the subcommittee feed back to the board, and then how do you get that additional kind of accountability and governance from other organisations?
I wonder if that's ones that Sue, perhaps you could pick up.
In terms of other agencies, sorry, what? I'm not quite sure what that...
So it's how does the subcommittee feed back to the board, but also interested in where you're needing kind of accountability or good governance in other agencies. They're integral into kind of some of your abilities to handle some of the concerns that get raised. So how does it work back to the board, and then I guess what's within the board's gift?
So really I think that the subcommittee is looking almost inevitably, it's a bit sort of retrospective, but it does report, it provides a detailed report from Peter that goes to the service delivery committee. So that's like every meeting that gets discussed by the service delivery committee, the trustees on that. And then they in turn will pick up any particular issues if there are any, or provide a sort of summary review of their discussions up to the board. In terms of other agencies, I think that's more within the sort of the management side of things. So we obviously have our central teams, and they deal more directly in terms of the actual, if that's meaning like the CQC, people like that, the local authority teams, etc. That's done sort of more as a management function. But I may be not quite understanding the question here, I think.
Well, let's see if Helen comes back to us. I'll just pick up a couple of other questions. So Karen asks, what's the background of the external members of the committee besides the CQC background that somebody mentioned?
I could do that as well if you like. Yeah. We did mention partly, I think. So yes, we've got our ex-CQC inspector is one. We have a consultant now, but who was formerly safeguarding and is pretty much an expert on the Mental Capacity Act and deprivation of liberty, as well as safeguarding, and was a former head of a local authority safeguarding team, and does training. He does the training for the subcommittee as well. So he's a really informative person, really expert in his field. And then we have literally just had confirmation that we are getting a new external member who is a representative from SCI, so the Social Care Institute for Excellence, and that is there. They've recently appointed a safeguarding specialist, and she will be also joining the SASC from December,
Oh, great. Oh, so you feel you've got power to your elbow.
Yeah, yes, and just
Really?
it's great having those different views, those different, you know, perspectives.
And I've got a question, just looking at Suzanne's slides. What do you think's been the kind of most important achievement from having the committee? And I guess the opposite question really as well. What continues to be a challenge despite the committee?
I'm not sure if you wanted me to answer.
Yeah,
that. I mean,
yeah, great.
Yeah. In terms of what has been the most important achievements, I suppose in some ways that's quite difficult for me to answer because you know, I had no experience of how things were before the Safeguarding Adults subcommittee started up. But I would say, from the perspective of what I've done, I think probably the most important achievements we've done is managing to really thoroughly look over all of the safeguarding, make sure that it's really well looked into, that any lessons are learned and shared, and that improvements and changes, even little small things, such as ensuring that there's contemporaneous, thorough record keeping, you know, keeping the individual at the centre of the concerns, and sort of checking up with them and their relatives that things are progressing as they would like them to. I think it's really the thoroughness and the detail that I would pick out as the best achievement. Ongoing difficulties, I think it's just the challenges that face care all the time. We've struggled a little bit in getting service users involved in the committee, as Peter mentioned before. It's not easy, but we worked really hard to bring their voices into the committee, even if they're not actually sitting there. Yeah.
And there's an interesting question from Andrea. She's asking about the training that members of the committee get, and kind of having a bit more insight into that, because that might be something useful for colleagues to understand how the members of the committee are equipped for their role. Yeah.
Well, we have very regular training sessions. I think Peter can probably give more detail on that, but I would say that at least once a year, but probably more than that, we have a session on something that's very relevant to the area. We have updates from experts on the MCA and deprivation of liberties, and just general discussion from experts on aspects of care. I've also attended as a relative representative. I attended a training conference that included quite a lot about lack of self-care. So it's ongoing. Every committee meeting, I learn something from the experts who are there.
Yeah. Well, every day is a school day, I discover, as I get older. And Karen's asking if the committee members are all volunteers, or do they get paid? Because it's quite heavy. They've got quite a lot of responsibility and time commitments. So they're all volunteers, are they?
I'm a volunteer, and I obviously get paid my my travel expenses. Lunch is put on, so but I volunteer. Yeah, I don't get paid. I can't speak for anybody else in the committee.
Thank you.
The external members are paid. The trustees, obviously, they're volunteers, and the members of staff, obviously, it's part of their role.
Okay, so you've got a bit of a mixed model. Okay. Yeah. I'm conscious of time, and I think we're due to finish at 11, are we? And I think it is 11. So I'm going to draw us to a close. Thank you to all of our presenters for your time and your expertise, and being so generous, giving us dedicated time for our colleagues on the call. Thank you to everyone who joined the call. Great to see you. Hope you found it useful. We'll get the slides out after the session. And you know where Peter is should you wish for any more input from him, and you know where we are. And have a great day. Thanks very much, everybody.